What is the emoluments clause? And how has Trump run afoul of it?
So I'm one of the lawyers on a suit representing CREW, a watchdog group in Washington, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and a few other plaintiffs suing Donald Trump for violating both the foreign emoluments clause and the domestic emoluments clause. These are two clauses in the Constitution that are anti-corruption clauses. The foreign emoluments clause prohibits federal officers from taking presents, emoluments, offices, or titles of nobility of any kind whatever from a foreign government without congressional consent. And this is, I got interested in this clause when I started writing about corruption because it was actually a very American clause. Like this clause saying that you couldn't take gifts and emoluments from foreign governments.
Before we go further, I'm going to need you to define the word emolument.
Oh, yes. Okay, sure.
We keep saying it, and I keep falling down the hole.
And you keep thinking, what kind of French moisturizer is
that?
That?
I am extremely good at nodding confidently while people say things I don't understand, but nobody can see me doing that here.
Okay.
So,
an emolument is a benefit. It's a benefit. And if you look at the word at the time, I think we now have this sense like, this strange word. But it was used in all kinds of documents at the time, and it covers all kinds of different benefits and profits and payments.
It does include profits, because it feels like there might be a difference between the King of Norway, hands you a bejeweled pencil, and you have an international frozen food conglomerate, and you make money from such and such. The one thing I want to establish as we go into this, because I think it's important for thinking about Trump, is that one way of thinking about this is that it's about gifts. It's about something that a foreign government just gives you to make you feel good. And another issue is Donald Trump has a hotel that has his name on it and his face on it and his name on it again in Scotland and in Istanbul and over and over and over again. But arguably, and that hotel can get money from the government. It can get tax breaks. All kinds of things can happen. But you could argue they're not giving him a gift. He's just a businessman who has international interests.
So the clause prohibits both gifts and emoluments. And it's really important that it includes both of those prohibitions, because it's very clear that it's not just about the gifts. It would have been a very different clause if it just says that the federal officer cannot take presents of any kind, whatever, from foreign governments. Instead, it says presents, emoluments, titles of nobility, and offices. And if you look at the cases of the time or the understanding of emoluments at the founding, it was used to describe commercial transactions as well as payments in relationship to holding an office. So it's a very broad understanding. It starts broad and then it gets broader because it's one of the very few clauses in the Constitution that tells you how to read it. It has this phrase, of any kind, whatever. So like if you had any doubt about the scope of this word,
that's interesting.
We're going to read the broadest possible understanding of the clause. Now you might say, oh dear, what are we going to do about the King of Norway giving individual pens? That'll sort of mess up foreign relations if the King of Norway isn't allowed to give a pen. And the answer is, well, the King of Norway can give you a pen and you can keep it as long as you get the consent of Congress. And what Congress has done is develop in the presence area, not in the emoluments area, but in the presence area, is develop a basically body of law that provides for de minimis exceptions so that you don't have to turn to the king and say, I'm not taking this right now. But if it's under a couple $100, you can just say thank you. But once you rise to the level of over a couple $100, you just have to go through a procedure in order to be able to take the present.
But and there's something interesting about this that you say in the book, which is that this was actually unusual. This is Americans did this, and it caused a lot of diplomatic confusion and friction for all. You have, I think this was actually in an op-ed you wrote, but you give this example of President Martin Van Buren having to write a letter to the Imam of Muscat, telling him he cannot accept horses, pearls, a Persian rug, shawls, and a sword, because it was against the law. And the Imam is offended because other countries do have much more of a gift culture. They do offer titles onto each other. and that this is something that exists in American history for a purpose and is part of our distinct character.
Absolutely. It was called a fundamental law of our republic in that letter when Van Buren was writing back. There was a version of this in the Articles of Confederation, and there were a series of gifts given by the French king, and it actually caused some real problems because the diplomats didn't want to give offense. And it's not just that they didn't want to give offense. You're a totally new country that may or may not survive, right? And you're willing to put this principle above the fear of causing some problems with foreign relations. It just shows you how incredibly important this was to Americans to reject what they saw as the corrupt culture of Europe. And so there's some pride in the early understanding that we're going to stand up against that corrupt culture. We're going to reject corruption and we're going to reject foreign influence. But also they're pretty smart. They get it that foreign countries are going to try to influence policy by giving gifts or by having financial relationships in the commercial sphere with the officers, and that can actually really have an influence.
So what are the emoluments that Donald Trump is receiving?
I'll just go through a few. One, you may be familiar with Trump Tower. It seems to be in the news fairly regularly.
I've heard of it.
So that there's two foreign governments who are tenants in Trump Tower. One is the commercial, one is basically the government of China. The Commercial and Industrial Bank of China is one of the largest tenants in Trump Tower. That lease is up for renegotiation in 2019. So we have money from the Chinese government going into Donald Trump's pocket every month, and the possibility of the Chinese government using their leverage with that negotiation to leverage foreign policy. That's one area. A second area is the apprentice, the royalties for the apprentice and the celebrity apprentice and the new celebrity apprentice flow from, in at least two cases, foreign governments because the royalties come from the governments itself. So the question is, if you look at foreign governments, it's not any foreign money. It's not private foreign money. What we're concerned about is foreign governmental money. Then there's the other example that you mentioned, which is the Trump organization has developments and that there are financial benefits to those developments in Saudi Arabia and other countries that come from the government to the Trump organization. One thing that more likely falls under the gifts part of the presents part of the emoluments clause is the trademarks that that Trump received just immediately after agreeing to continue to support the One China policy. So the Trump organization had been seeking trademarks in China for many, many years. Finally came out saying, we do support the One China policy, and within a week gets the trademarks.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, gets the trademarks approved.
That doesn't seem fishy at all. Right. That seems totally normal.
Right. And so, but to your question about what's an emolument and what's a present, that looks to be more like a present because it's something that was a pure gift. It's not part of a commercial transaction. It's just, here you go for helping us out on One China.
And one of the things that is unnerving about this is, in addition to that, there are all these ties and linkages, and given that we don't have his tax returns, there's a lot we may not know. Trump really just does seem to be the kind of guy who, if you make sure that your biggest parties happen in his hotels and you sort of show that he's great, that it's a non-trivial part of foreign policy right there.
I think that's right. And I think that's the bet that foreign governments all over the world are making.
I mean, like
right.
Saudi Arabia with that giant gold medal.
Right, I know.
It made me so embarrassed.
Yeah, it should. Yeah.
That they had pinned like how easy America was now going to be to manipulate.
Yeah, and what's important is that there's two kinds of manipulation. One is that he can be having actual open conversations that we will not find out about, that are kind of explicit deals, right? We don't know about that. And actually, this is one of the things the founders were worried about, is because Charles II in the 17th century had taken a pension from the French king and in exchange really sold out a lot of British policy to the French. The terms of that sellout weren't made public for over 100 years. So there could be private, actual kind of transactional relationships that we will not find out about. But the other thing that's possible, which is what you're talking about, is Trump can be influenced without him knowing. And that's actually one of the key sort of psychological insights of the framers, is that we're influenced by people who give us stuff. We're influenced by people who make us rich. And it doesn't have to be transactional. It could just be like, hey, I kind of like these people now. This is just basic psychology. And so you need a procedural protection like consent of Congress to sort of put the stops on that subtle kind of influence.
So what are the difficulties of suing a sitting president of the United States? And where does this go from here?
All that we've seen so far is a few comments right before Trump became president. And if you wonder about the impact of this suit, just remember that in the press conference right before he became president, he had a few things to talk about, but mostly he brought out his lawyer and a big stack of envelopes to say, don't worry, I'm not violating the emoluments clause. So clearly that they should be, they have been impacted by this. After the government's reply, we'll give our own reply, and we'll get a sense of where they think the limits are. What we saw in January is that the Trump lawyers at the time, and this is before he's president, were saying he is going to give away all his profits from the Trump hotels that come from foreign diplomats. That's an emolument I didn't talk about earlier. He's not doing that. Even if he was doing it, you don't get to sort of sin against the Constitution and then pay a penance and say, hey, I'm going to put in the treasury all this money that I should never have taken. Like, you don't sort of unilaterally deciding that you don't owe the IRS money and then separately giving it to the treasury. You just you don't get to do that. But that was the approach. And the other approach they had was that they said emoluments doesn't include commercial transactions. And we already talked about that. They're wrong as a matter of history and purpose, but we'll see if that's part of their brief going forward. But
will courts, I mean, this is just going to betray my own ignorance. I actually don't know just how difficult it is to sue the president. I mean, will courts give you standing, or does this end up in court, or is it a sort of long shot that you're hoping a judge will?
No, not at all.
offer?
I mean, we're in court in the Southern District of New York. There'll be a legal fight about whether the plaintiffs that we have the right to sue. This is your standing question. But it's, in terms of suing the president, I think the important thing to understand is we're not actually suing him for damages, which is problematic. We're just suing him for an injunction. Say, just stop violating the Constitution. What that means is he'd have to divest from his business interests, which is what other presidents have done. I mean, this is common practice, not just for presidents, but for federal officials, to divest of their interests and put them in a blind trust. And he should have done it before, and he can do it now. And we hope the court agrees with us and says he has to do that going forward.
So people, I think, hear the president's being sued for violating the Constitution, and people who are not fans of this president hope, oh, great, maybe the courts will just make him step down or something. That is not what this is.
No, it is not. No, this is, I mean, I think there's a few different things. It's really destabilizing to have your president making foreign policy decisions when his fingers are in the pie. I mean, it just casts a pall on every single foreign policy decision. But it also is a problem when your president is just openly violating the Constitution. I mean, that's a rule of law problem itself, to say that I don't really care about the words here. I think there's a value in him stopping, that has to do with just basic rule of law principles as well.